So
What did
there
you do
your
at pool timer?
marks.
I didn't see it.
I did, yeah. Go to your correct marks now, guys. Just immediately go, yeah.
Oh,
Holy
shit.
shit.
What the fuck?
Oh.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Eternal Palace, Ashara's home, the capital, the big place for the Naga. I'd love to talk to you about the aesthetic and the design of the place, but the two bosses we got to test were directly to the boss. There was no trash, and they were in reasonably bland sort of segmented areas. So I'm not saying the place is boring, just want to be clear, I'm not saying that, but the places we were in weren't very standout. There was no big distinctive area here. It felt a little bit, I agreed with what the Raiders said in my guild, which is that it felt very much like the first room in Tomb of Sargeras. That's what it felt like. You know, that first room you kind of enter, it looks like it kind of leads off to other places, but you don't get a feel for the place. I mean, that place ended up going all the way onto a spaceship. It ended up going all the way deep underground towards, like, Mistress Sazine. We had all that kind of stuff going on. It's just that the places we were in didn't show anything. But we do have another test tomorrow with 2 more bosses. So perhaps then we will get a idea of what we're going to be actually looking at, what the aesthetic of this place is, because right now, not much to comment on, unfortunately. So we did get to test 2 of the bosses today, which were Abyssal Commander Savara and Lady Ashvane, the thickness, the ultimate thickness. Now, a couple of comments here from what you're about to see is that this is not an important patch for Blizzard. This is an important patch for Blizzard in terms of tuning numbers, and that's because it is the first patch we are getting the new Essence system. Now, some of you have probably heard about the Essence system. Even if you're not that hype about it, one thing it is doing is astronomically boosting damage numbers and healing numbers and things like that. I mean, huge, enormous boosts to your DPS. They really do sort of, as they stand right now, unless they change, they basically nullify everything that's in the game right now on live that you're playing. So if you're struggling with, say, Jaina Proudmoore in some way, or maybe Heroic Una or whatever, when the new Essences come in, you're going to crush them into the ground because they are that powerful. And so Blizzard needs to figure out how powerful those things are. Like, exactly what are the players going to do with this brand new nuclear weapon we've handed to them. What that means, of course, is a lot of the bosses had way more HP than they were supposed to do. This is heroic difficulty, and also did way more damage than they were supposed to do. Some of the mechanics you're going to see here as well seem to be listed as the mythic mechanics. So entirely possible that we're actually doing the mythic encounter despite the fact it's the heroic encounter. Okay, so just bear that in mind as well. Just so, more or less, we're going to look at the look and feel of these bosses rather than getting into the nitty-gritty of damage and things like that. That's all I'm trying to say here. So the first boss was, of course, Abyssal Commander Savara. This is actually the first boss. This is the very first boss you will see. It's also the boss that appears in Nazjatar in the very opening storyline of there. So you get a little bit of backstory on Abyssal Commander Savara and all that kind of stuff. And it's an interesting mix of, like, Thaddeus and Zul'Harak. The whole system is, if you never face those bosses, is the idea of having opposing buffs on the raid and mixing them together. Really bad idea. Really bad idea. So they're going with Frost and Poison this time, or Frost and Toxic. So you either become a blue boy or you become a green boy. And if you're a blue boy and you shake hands with a green boy, you cause the entire raid to take massive amounts of damage. Like, this is insanely punishing. But as I said, the numbers aren't final, so it's probably going to be nothing like this, because there is no fucking way a pug is dealing with this boss in its current state. Absolutely no way. Our first pull was ultra hilarious. We thought we had some grace period, some grace time and stuff like that. Went in, boom! boom. But yeah, it was still pretty fun. So ultimately, the idea here is pretty simple. Even though we had these massive damage buffs, it didn't seem like it had a huge amount of HP. But generally speaking, you're going to put the Frost on one side and the green on the other side. And it actually had mixes of something from Classic, which I haven't seen for a while. I believe it was Lethon. Yeah, one of the Emerald Dragons from Classic. In that you have to watch the floor to see where the feet of the boss are facing and what color they are. They glow. So if they glow green, she's going to shoot toxic spears out of that side. If they glow blue, she's going to shoot frost spears out of that side. And of course, as I just mentioned, if you are a frost boy and you get hit by a toxic blade, then you're going to AoE the whole raid. Now, this stuff was actually pretty simple to counter because, one, they're very clear and they're super slow. And what also became pretty apparent early on, this seems like it's a very melee-friendly raid. and that might be an agenda they're heavily pushing to stop this range domination, is that it's seemingly a very melee-friendly raid, in which case the melee can do quite a lot of stuff. So, along with some debuffs where you're going to have to move out of the pack and drop some patches and things like that, and then periodically, similar to Thaddeus, it's going to switch some people's debuffs. So if you did Maiden in Tomb of Sargeras, things like that, it's going to swap you, but not guaranteed, so you might get Frost and then it swaps. No cast bar or anything for this, which made it really tricky to manage, because it was like, sometime now she's going to swap everyone's colors, you know, sometime around now it's going to happen, maybe, and you're trying to work it out from there. But essentially, what ultimately I believe will be a relatively simple boss of managing these debuffs, and there's also some spears. So she'll say, I'm throwing a frost spear at a certain player. This seemed to be easily counterable, in our opinion, by just, if you look at the boss itself and you say east and west are the stacking points for the frost and the toxic, and then she shoots the spears, you use north and south for those. So if she's shooting a frost spear, you go north, and of course, because the way it works, as you can probably imagine, I should be clear on this though, is that she will try and sometimes she will throw a frost spear at a toxic player, right? I know, toxic player. So she'll try and throw a frost spear at somebody who has the poison debuff, and if that frost spear hits the poison debuff, then it AoEs the raid. But what you can do is have a frost person stand between the boss who's throwing a frost spear and the poison player and get hit by the spear, and for them it's fine, it's no problem, because they're debuffed with frost, which means the frost spear doesn't actually do anything to them pretty much, and prevents all that damage. And then you can actually, similar to the first boss in the Black Temple, is pull that spear out of them, but you have to make sure that the right colors are pulling the right things out. Very simple system once you get used to it, but in the moment, very overtuned for a heroic boss. Felt very much like a mythic boss, to be honest with you, but I expect that it will be adjusted, so don't worry about that. Let's move on to a boss that most people have been actually looking forward to seeing, which was Lady Ashvane. We know Lady Ashvane transforms into... She's a cutie. She's a cutie, boys. Oh, yeah, she's a cutie. This boss is pretty intense, actually, but lots of problems with it. I just want to be clear on this on the footage you're going to see. Lots of problems with this. A lot of the mechanics she was doing were turned up to like 25, where they should have been at 10. Yeah, I know the meme is 11, but yeah, we had things like, she doesn't have a lot of HP. As you can see, she has about 90 million with the amount of players we had in there. But what she does have is an enormous shield, a hardened carapace. So you kind of got to break through her armor. So she takes no damage, and then as you can expect, once you do break through that shield, she has a weakened phase where you can kind of nuke her down. So that's the idea. But we've got some sort of globulous stuff going on here. You're going to be kiting her around. Now, this boss, even with the tuning numbers aside, let's ignore the damage needed and the damage she does. Let's ignore that. This boss is susceptible to massive RNG, from what we can tell. And that's going to be a problem. Certainly if that carries over into... Even in Heroic, it felt like too much. And the RNG comes from the coral. So in a raid... We did test this. The coral that she spawns in the room spawns within a radius around her. And it's quite a large radius. There's no influence from players whatsoever on where this coral spawns. This means that the coral, because of its large radius, can be like practically anywhere in the room. Like it seems to reach over 50% of the room from wherever she is stood. Why is that a problem, you might ask? Well, the fact is, the coral, periodically, when she casts a spell called Rippling Wave, and she does this sort of every 30 seconds or every minute or so, causes a bubble to spawn from the coral and start traveling towards her. Quite a slow bubble. And these bubbles do massive amounts of damage, like huge amounts of damage. Now, that might get tuned down, in which case this won't be that much of a big deal, but the RNG spawn locations of these corals will still be our problem, because if they just decide in this massive radius that she has to spawn near her, that starts making a lot of problems. So you might think, okay, they've spawned too close, now we need to move the boss to, say, the other side of the room. That's a little tricky, because she's doing the Grobulus thing of also dropping these patches on the floor, which fill up the room, and they are permanent as well. So depending on where the coral spawns that causes these patches as well, the bubbles can spawn in such a way that a lot of them are clumped together, and certainly the idea with these bubbles is that you stagger popping them. So you need a player to run into them to pop the bubbles. That'll do massive raid damage, and they start taking a very heavy damage ticking dot. Then more coral spawns, and you can very quickly be in a situation, depending on the RNG of these coral spawns, where there's just nowhere to go. And ultimately, it looks to us like you're supposed to weaken her twice to kill her, is what it was looking at for us, is you have to break through the shield twice, and she'll be weakened for 2 times, and you need to kill her in the second weaken phase. That seems to be what they're aiming for. We ended up with some situations where there was just barely any room left because of just the nature of things that have spawned. Now, you can get rid of the coral by, when she's in the weaken phase, 6 players, or at least 6 players in the size of our raid, were marked, and 2 of the players have matching marks. Now, what will happen here is, let's say 2 players have the orange mark. Those players need to position themselves in such a way that after a few seconds, a cutting beam will link both of those players together, and any coral in between those 2 players will be destroyed. Now, that's a little tricky to organize straight off the bat, so we tried to get a system where if it was like on a melee player in a range, the melee player would stand still, and the ranged player would go out and figure out the best angle to destroy as much coral as possible. Something pretty similar to that, right? And try and work that out. Now, the beam was super thin, so even when I did it and tried to line it up, so I think it was me and the tank, because the tank does get this as well, and obviously the tank's not going to move. So I tried to position myself so I would destroy as much coral as possible. Even though the line did go through the coral, if it didn't go through the exact center, it wouldn't destroy it. Again, something that can be fixed, but also very awkward that they don't just show the beam from the start. That would be so helpful if we had a visual indicator, because you don't. All you have is the 2 players with a mark above their head. They have to figure out the line between them instead of being able to say, okay, a bit more, a bit more right, a bit more left, especially when you're using a room this large. It's not that easy to see, because if you're having to push yourself against a wall, depending on where the coral is, it's a little awkward to see exactly which coral is being cut. Nevertheless, very awkward with the RNG sometimes. But overall, a very fun fight. I don't want to complain about this. This fight has great potential to be a really intense fight. Lots of adjustment needed to be done on the move. So we had things like the tanks go in, coral spawns immediately upon starting, and then judging by the RNG spawns of the coral, where do we think the best point is to start moving the boss to, say, a wall or to a certain position where that boss can start dropping its patches and make the path that we're going to take as good as possible. I will point out some funny stuff that was happening with this is these very, very dangerous bubbles that were spawning. You could just run the boss in a circle. We did try it just for fun, but you could actually just have the tanks running full speed in a circle around the room, and the bubbles would never catch up to the boss, so they'd never pop, and when it spawns the next wave of bubbles, the old ones just despawn. So, as it currently stands, and I'm sure it won't go live this way, is you could have the tanks just running laps around the room without doing anything at all. That is a perfectly viable strategy as it is right now, which is kind of funny, but obviously it's not the way it's going to go live. You're supposed to deal with this mechanic. On top of that, we just had some simple things of people getting cubed, and you've got to break the cubes and things like that. But a very interesting boss. I don't want to harp too much on the RNG. I think, in fact, a lot of this boss could be made significantly better if they simply reduce the radius of the coral spawn from her location. That's all. If they made it so you could be a little bit more predictable with where the coral is, so that you're not getting them spawning in, like, the safe space you've left. The issue here is, as you are filling up the room, and it can fill up rather quickly, is you might you might be planning to, okay, this is the best place to start, and we're going to leave that area clear later. RNG coral spawns could just take up that spot, and you just simply have nowhere to go. And it's as simple as that, and there's nothing you've done wrong. There's nothing you could do about it. It's just the way that the fight's gone. And what you don't want to end up in is a situation where people are over and over again pulling the boss to see, like, where the first coral spawns, because that's going to affect you for the remainder of the fight. And it's better to pull the boss, see where the first coral is, reset the boss because it's not in a decent one. Because we definitely had some pulls, even within the 1 hour we get to test this, where it was so much easier. The fight was considerably easier and fully manageable. So you might be asking, why don't you kill it? Currently, for some reason, after the first weaken phase, the shield the boss puts up and puts back up ultimately was considerably larger than it should have been by about 60%, which means breaking the second shield was a real pain in the ass, like a real pain in the ass. And it's not, according to the Dungeon Jill, it's not supposed to be that way. And the bubble pops are supposed to do about a third of the damage that they were actually doing. So maybe, again, we were doing the mythic one. Maybe they just turned all the numbers up to figure out how the essences are working, something along those lines. But overall, an interesting start. Not overwhelmingly great. Certainly nothing like when we saw Mecha Talk for the first time, or saw Stormwall for the first time, or saw many of the Battle for Dazar'alor bosses for the first time. And the aesthetic, not great yet, but might turn out to be. So we'll wait and see. Tomorrow, we're going to be testing... I think we're doing the hatchery, which should be like a multi-boss fight. That sounds like it's going to be pretty goddamn cool. And something else. So... wait and see on that one and see if we get to have a little deeper look inside, because always nice if you can actually have a mooch around and see what's going on. Thank you so much for listening, guys. I'll see you again. Bye-bye.